history lesson is going to keep going. Um, so Shabbat Shalom on this Independence Day. And we need to praise Yahweh for letting us be born in this season and in this place, and so that we can know him and his son. That's, that's the root cause of talking about our country on this day, is that this country as Corky saying, there's not really a verse for it. But when you look back, this country was supposed to be here. And the things that had to happen to make it happen are remarkable. And there's not enough time in the rest of our lives to tell all the stories and how things have occurred. But let's thank God for we and his son that we've eaten what's theirs and we live in a land that is still free. And today we're going to talk about our country. So you just heard the whole declaration. Here's going to be some bits of it. Um, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to separation. The history that came for this to happen, for this document to be written, is no way is it by chance. In order for the people to come from Christopher Columbus and then Amerigo Vespucci, who gets no credit for founding this land, right? Right? We're called America because of Amerigo Vespucci, who proved that this wasn't the East Indies. Columbus thought he found another way to India, and that's why the Indians are called Indians. And so Amerigo Vespucci came second, and he proved that this land is nope, that's actually a new world. And think about all the people who had to brave the Atlantic Ocean in ships that we would consider rafts today. We wouldn't get on those ships. We and the smells and the lack of, I mean, we get on a ship today and we expect it to have plumbing. We expect it to have food, water, doctors. We get on ships today. What they called a ship, we would call a hobby. It was absurd what they did. Think of the adversity. The percentage of people who did not survive the journey would make us not go today. Think about the way our news reports things. Oh, somebody, there was a turbulence at an airline and somebody got bonked, and then people are like, but it's still safe to fly. Obviously, it's still safe to fly. You don't have to tell us that. They act like we are so fragile, but we're not fragile. Our forefathers did things that we wouldn't even think about doing today. Think of the work that had to be performed to make our eastern seaboard habitable. That was nothing. It was nothing. Well, it was wilderness, and there was some Indian settlements and such like that, but they didn't have ships, they didn't have harbors, they didn't have civilization. Taking stores on and off, having piers, having cities in order to receive the goods, and then having a network of roads and distribution in order to be able to distribute the stuff. We are taught about the Declaration in schools and in our history books, and what happened without this context of knowing how primitive this land was. It was founded by primitive people. They were just less primitive than the people who were on this land. They had to bring horses. Can you imagine those little bitty ships? How many of those little bitty ships it took to bring horses over here? Because we didn't have horses. And that was the mode of transportation. That's how the work gets done. That's how big things were moved, by a team of horses. In order to erect a building or to do something like that, they had to tie the horses and have them back up and do these large things. All the individual stories that had to unfold to have people living in Europe who've lived in Europe for 1,000 years saying the unknown is better than this known. That is unusual. That's very unusual to occur today. If you see, the John Mellencamp song, or where the factory goes out of business and the people don't move. The factory goes out of business. It's not coming back into business, right? And then The people stay there going, gosh, we hope the factory comes back. It's unusual for people to go and say, I'm going to go where the work is. That wasn't unusual back then. And that's different for us today. Um, uh, the fact that they were all willing to risk certain death for the chance to have something free from British and European rule was unthinkable at the time. I mean, if you think about the state of mankind when this continent got settled and those few hundred years, 100 years before it became, we had the revolution or whatever, that's a couple hundred years. All the way back into history, it was all about kings. It was about feudal systems, dictatorships. They had some legislative authority in Europe, but clearly it wasn't adhered to, or the king couldn't have done to us what he did, right? They pass a law and then it's not a law anymore. It's a law, it's not a law. So being when we're a church, we usually spend our time and efforts here talking about a different nation. We usually talk about the nation of Israel, and we usually talk about the kingdom of Yahweh. But we look at the miraculous birth of Israel, its downfalls and its obliteration, and we track from Genesis to Revelation, and that's where we found our worldview. But today, we're going to talk about our own country. Instead of talking about first century Judea and how the gospel worked its way through the Roman Empire, we're going to talk about our earthly nation because we need to. As Corky's talking, one of the reasons that people don't stand up for the anthem is we play it all the time, right? Things aren't holy if they're used all the time, right? And the military honors is about the only thing this country has left that is holy. And if you watch the Olympics, we bring home 200 medals. That's 200 times that anthem. I mean, you see the Europeans come over here, they know the words to our song, right? Because they hear it all the time. So, it is, it is a shame, but it's also a part of, I guess, a cause of our greatness that our song gets played all the time, you know? Alex sold me out at the ball game once because they were like, "Do we have any veterans in the house?" She's like, "He is." Now everybody want to thank you and tell you stuff, and you're like, right, right. And then now that through George W., Corky and I were supposed to salute during that, right? But that's a 5-minute song, okay, okay. And George W. made a decree that all veterans are to salute when the anthem is on. But we don't want to do that. We didn't do anything for glory. We're not a prop, right? But at any rate, our forefathers envisioned a place of freedom from tyranny and the vicious cycles of violence and feudalism of history. They had no idea this was going to turn into the seat of power for Earth. Do you understand? I was watching a video the other day and they were talking about antiquity and history. I was watching all these historical videos and they were talking about how the Roman Empire, this is Jewish guys talking, and they said, well, today we're under the American Empire. And he said it so casually, but he's right. The world is run by this country. We protect all of the seas, all of them. And you notice whenever something goes wrong in the world, they go, "Where's America? Where's America? Where's America?" And then we're there, right? That's amazing. And the founders had no idea. The fact they just wanted to be left alone. They didn't want to be involved with the rest of the world. They wanted this to be their world. So the religious affiliation of the 56 signers and is pretty impressive. There were 32 Episcopalians, 13 Congregationalists, 12 Presbyterians, 2 Quakers, 1 Unitarian Universalist, 1 Catholic. 56 men signed to the Declaration. But as Corky just talked about, there were 56 well-off men from all 13 colonies who swore their lives and their wealth to revolt from England. They had good lives. And this is very, very different from other revolutions. Very different. What happens in the other revolutions is poor people organize who have never led or owned anything, organize it under the guise of freedom so that they get to become the dictator. That we have a garbage man. Well, actually, Trump arrested him. We had an actual garbage man, or a bus driver was in charge of Venezuela not that long ago. That's what Maduro was before being the vice president of Venezuela. He was a school bus driver. Now, I'm not looking down on school bus drivers, but you go from that to dictator. Obviously, the country's going to fall apart. In our founding, the men who were running this country decided that it would be better off for future generations for them to risk everything and go broke trying to break from the bonds of tyranny. That is so altruistic that it goes beyond words, right? What happened with the Bolshevik Revolution? The people's states, right? People states, meaning the people who've never run anything are all of a sudden in charge. And what is the first thing they do? Shoot anybody who could challenge them. Okay, okay. They make a wall around them and they execute everybody and they make themselves insulated and they consolidate power. The literal opposite is what happened at the founding of this country. The men fought in order to get rid of the power, in order to disperse it to the different states and the legislatures and to spread it out. So not only did they give up their wealth and risk their lives, they also didn't do it with any type of motive for self in there at all, other than they wanted to have freedom, and they probably had different ideas of what that freedom looked like. But the statesmen of this continent decided to cast off Britain, knowing they were going to lose everything and lose their lives, likely lose their lives. We live now, and it's very, very hard for us to imagine, but they were throwing off a king with a fake representative government in favor of the unknown. They did not know what lied ahead. Now, this disbursement of power is not unheard of in history. There is another nation that had the similar setup. That's the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel didn't have a centralized government. It had the Levitical high priest was the representative, but if they were going to make any decisions, national decisions or whatever, they had to call up elders from each tribe to come into the seat of the nation in order to make decisions. Each one of the tribes had its own banner, it was its own state, it was its own nation, and they had to decide if they were going to help each other or not. So it's not unheard of to have it set up like this. They had to voluntarily respect each other and come together with elders as representatives to function in the land that was then called Canaan. That's interesting that our country was founded on a very similar principle. Not that we are going to throw off the king and set that same system up over here under a different ruler, but that these 13 colonies were going to be independent states and have to be respected with the powers to make war and the powers to even have commerce and have their own autonomy. Romans 13, 1-7 is kind of a problem, though. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, For rulers are servants to God, servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due to them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, and fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. It's a little bit of a problem when you want to have a revolution as a Christian, and you believe that rulers are put in place by God. That's a difficult bridge to go over. The only revolution that I know of that was sanctioned was the Maccabean revolt against the Greek invaders. That's not scripture, but we know Yahweh raises up kingdoms to perform his will. 70 went into Egypt and 2 million were chased out. Babylon was used to smite Israel. Persia was used to restore Judea. The Greeks were used to give a common language to the world, whereas Rome actually ditched their own language for Greek because they had such an affinity for Greece. The Romans were used to allow the world to have a common empire from which the gospel spread, which allowed for travel and a specific paradigm that allowed the religion to take hold. But under monarchies, you kind of had to wait for one to die in order for your life to change. This is another thing that we who've been born and raised over here cannot understand. A king that's always going to be a king. And whatever he whims is law. We have no idea. We don't have any type of I guess the DMV would be the only thing that we could actually come close to, right? Even our military, the people have to change hands and change whatnot. Your method of politicking was the king is dead, long live the king. England had adopted some representative government, but the king was abusing it. And these guys tried everything they could to not have to revolt. That's the purpose of the Declaration. Say, look, we're trying to work it out. And England made the biggest mistake in the history of mistakes. Because had they said, you guys run it and just send me 10%, they would still be the biggest empire on this planet. They would still be on top. But because he wanted the dictatorship, whoops, shouldn't have done that. They didn't lead a rebellion. They told England, we're independent and we're not part of you anymore. It was England who brought the army and the fighting. Now, of course, with all the problems, the violence, and the difficulties that they had with the standing army and the quartering of troops, they knew what was coming. But the king had a choice to make, and he chose violence. The king was not going to let the land of plenty go without a fight. He had relented from his treachery and worked even an unreasonable deal would have been accepted. If he had just treated them repeatedly, it would have been accepted. The colonists, though, by the way, the French were our navy. We didn't have a navy, by the way, right? They sank that one guy's boats. That was the navy, right? Right? They sank it because we didn't need one. We owe our freedom to France. Now, the French didn't have altruistic motives. They wanted to stick it to the British. They didn't like England. So they supplied us and they came over here and they fought and they trained and they were on the battlefield and they were our navy. So without France, we aren't a country. No way. No, there's just no way around it, right? You got the gunpowder has to come from somewhere, right? And the food and the ships. And there's a famous battle that I'm sure Ross will tell me about it after, but there's a famous battle where the French had to actually, take out the British Navy, and the British Navy at the time was the biggest navy in the world. So that's a different story. But the colonists took to natural law to justify their actions. Instead of Romans 13, they used Romans 1. And mankind has a natural state that was abused by the tyrannical rule of the king. And there were many preachers who helped this process along by buying into the revolution. This is one of the reasons I spoke of the religious affiliation of the signers and the founders, because that was how the information was disseminated. Churches were where you went and gathered once a week and you learned news and you saw your neighbors. And if the preachers weren't on board with this at large, it wouldn't have happened. They could have just kept pointing to Romans 13 over and over and over. Nope, we can't do it. We can't. And they probably did for a decade. They probably did for a while, and the people got upset about it. Um, in hindsight, we can clearly see that our revolution was ordained by the Most High. This nation has been a force for good on a scale never before imagined. And our penchant is to be left alone. And up until World War I, we were like, we would only go out to secure our own people, to secure trade, to do things like that. We didn't really care that much about Europe, right? In World War I, it was called the war over there. Now, we were sending arms, we were helping out, and then we went and rescued them. But then we came home and dismantled it all. When we came home from World War I, we went down to being the 14th largest military on the earth. We were not interested in going back, period. When the Japanese hit us, we were not what we are today by any stretch of the imagination. Our military was not foremost, even though it was built, the World War II was building it up. But after World War II and the advent of nuclear weapons, we couldn't come home anymore. Obviously, Europe can't govern itself, right? Twice they brought the whole world in over there, right? I mean, obviously, you can't be trusted to run your countries, and so we didn't come home anymore. And this nation has been a force for good for 250 years, and our demise is a certainty. Right? Do not think this is just going to keep going. Nations rise and nations fall, and we are used by Yahweh for what we're used for. And sometimes nations are used for good, and sometimes nations are used as an example of bad. and at some point, the prophecy does not include the United States. All right. I know that people like to shoehorn us in there and say we're this and we're that. No, we're not in there. Right. So this is probably going to go away at some point, or at least stop being a national and international power. I personally think that it will divide up the division that we have had since COVID, actually since George W. Since George W., this country has just been people are just like us versus them, us versus them, us versus them, more and more and more. And then, then we had the COVID stuff. By the way, it did go away, and all the people are like, "Oh, those masks are never going to go away," and they went away. Okay, sorry, right? They thought it was the end. Then we thought the BLM riots was the end, right? We all know that that the differences in the politics today are not bridgeable. They're so personal that people hate each other so much that that either side will actually vote to harm themselves if it would help the other person. And that's not going to last. That something's going to have to break for that to go away. And some of these issues are too big. You can't compromise on changing genders of babies. Like, how do you meet somebody halfway on that? Right? That's ridiculous. Right? And it's just more and more absurd. So our demise, is certain. And a lot of people have wasted a lot of time trying to predict it with embarrassingly bad results. Okay. Okay. In my time in the Hebrew Roots movement, the earth was supposed to die like every other year. It was all supposed to be over. And I suffer from apocalypse saturation syndrome. I am not hearing it anymore. It's probably detrimental, but that's why you don't hear me talk about it, because it's like, well, you should really be focusing on how you're supposed to live. All the parables was live right. You don't matter when he comes back. Right? If you're living right when the master comes back, you've got nothing to worry about. Right? Right? So, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That's a slam. You do not consent to be governed in a monarchy. You are a subject, not a citizen. You're a subject to the laws of that monarchy. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same objective evinces, a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to produce new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and is now the necessity to which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. Now, I have highlighted the part about more disposed to suffer, like a frog getting boiled. People will just take it. They don't want to change. They don't want to move. They don't want to challenge. They don't want to take risks. They want predictability. You stay at a job and you're treated poorly by your boss for years and years and years and years because the unknown is scarier than the known bad. That's just mankind. In this case, they didn't, they decided unknown was better than known. Then they had to move on. They resorted to the natural world order, that it's obvious we're not supposed to be oppressed, right? A lot of times, and the only analogy is, it's a terrible analogy, but if you're a bad marriage, if you're an abusive marriage, right? And the woman doesn't have money, the woman doesn't have nothing, right? Where's she going to go? What's she going to do? Right? She's stuck. And they suffer it forever and ever and ever and ever. And they go back to guys that beat them and whatever. And you're like, why would they do that? Well, because of this. Because of this, the unknown is worse than the known. In this case, they had to say, hey, you know what? It's pretty obvious that we shouldn't be forced to kill our countrymen. Right? Hijacked on the high seas and then forced to execute your own family member. That's not governing. That's the cartels. That's the Islamic stuff. That's just the demonic activity right there. Government should bring order to free people, not chaos to the oppressed. And these guys tried everything they could to solve the problem without revolting. They operated in the daylight. That's the key. They wrote the open letter. They took a vote. They put time into it and submitted to other people's opinions and were humble about it. Tyranny and evil are darkness, right? Darkness is you have a guy or you have a pretend kangaroo court or remember Saddam Hussein had a parliament, right? Saddam Hussein had a parliament and they always voted for whatever he wanted, right? And they never stood up to him. Then you don't really have a parliament, right? You have a fake government. And so these guys are willing to operate in the daylight. That's a sign of righteousness. They wrote an open letter to the king and to mankind. That declaration wasn't just from here to there. It was from here to any of the others. This is what's happening. This is what we're doing. And if you could, please send money. Send money, send food, send arms. They wrote an open letter. They listed their abuses, announced that they'd had enough, informed the world, and let the chips fall where they may. That's pretty much all they could do, you know? They didn't have an exit strategy or even a plan for how to govern this land. See, that's another thing that points to altruism. If they said, okay, let's decide which one of us is going to be ruler of which, let's divide up this future country, and then we're going to just say that we're breaking up with the king. That would have been treachery, right? If they had decided who was going to be the governor of Georgia, of Virginia, of all these different states, and then they set it up with a shadow government and then went forth, that would have been a little shady. But they didn't do that. They operated in the daylight. The legislatures operated in the daylight. The meetings were in the daylight. They published their minutes. They published the letter. That's showing you righteousness and humility in leadership. We don't have that today. Today we have 2,000-page legislation passed in the dead of night and signed in darkness, and we wake up the next morning and it's a totally different country, right? And they're both doing it, right? And the answer to fixing it, the problem, is not for both sides to do it. It's for neither side to do it. They haven't passed a real legislation in forever. They keep finding these little parliamentarian tricks to which they can kind of get by with one or two votes, and they pass something and then they go off to conference and it comes out something completely different. This is not how our founders operated. Our founders operated in daylight. And the Declaration was July 4th, 1776, and the revolution ended in September 3rd, 1783. The Constitutional Convention ended September 17th, 1787. It took 4 years after the war for us to figure out how this country was going to be governed. Obviously, they didn't go into this with a plan, right? They went into this saying, we're going to try something new because this isn't working. This is a sign of righteousness. Other revolutions are often alternatives to the ballot box, meaning things that people would never vote for are brought about through revolution that they cannot stop. Do you think the people would have fought in the Bolshevik Revolution if they knew they were going to wake up as slaves to the Communist Party? I don't think they would have done that. I don't think the Chinese would have supported what the outcome of Chairman Mao's revolution as well. These other countries, they convinced the populace that if they just give up all their property, give up all their rights, then everybody's going to be rich. We're going to go take the billionaires and the trillionaires' money and we're going to divide it up. And you know what happens right after that? It's all spent. And then 10 years after that, the people who had it the first time have it back because that's what they do. They know how to run businesses, right? You drop these guys like Musk or Henry Ford or all these captains of industry, Howard Hughes, you drop them at any given time, they're going to figure it out. They're going to organize for success and they're going to come out on top. So we don't have that wealth envy over here. We're not supposed to. We're supposed to lift everybody up so everybody can have something. The U.S. Revolution, the wealthy volunteered their wealth to fund the fight against tyranny. And then afterwards, they created a nation where it's possible for anyone to gain wealth, power, or notoriety, or could do something, believing could do so, blah, blah, blah. But our revolution was unique. In the end, a more moral union was formed. 2 Samuel 11:1, that it happened in the spring at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem. This is, used to talk about this a lot back in leadership days, but King David's fault was thinking that he was so important and so easy that he could just send his people off to battle. And he stopped going. If you guys don't know, the purpose of a king is to be the military leader of a country. That's the purpose of a king, okay? And that's why all the king of England and his whole family are all veterans, and they all the sons even served in helicopters in Afghanistan or whatever, because the king is supposed to be the military commander. And David came up as a military commander, but the time he decided to stay home, what happened? All the men were gone, and there's a lovely lady taking a bath on top of her house right in the sight of the king. And he sinned. Washington did not do that. If you guys want to get an education, if you want to read a history book that you cannot put down, it's called George Washington's Secret Six. And it is amazing what that man did as far as the intelligence gathering and setting up spy networks and all the danger that they were in, the cloak and dagger stuff. He was at risk all the time. Okay, the invincibility factor notwithstanding, he was at risk all the time. And yes, yes, some of the stuff they developed we still use today. Um, the disappearing ink, the lemon thing that they use in National Treasure, that's real. Yeah, yeah, yeah. All that stuff is kind of cool. Um, but George Washington, he was daring, he was cunning. And that book, that Washington Secret Six, is just absolutely fabulous. And remember, the British owned the continent, right? I can't even fathom it. But it wasn't them occupying they didn't invade. They owned this continent. So they were everywhere. And their soldiers could be anywhere and they could question you at any time. You had no rights whatsoever. And so for them to pass messages and to meet people, the soldiers were always looking, and you didn't know who you could trust and who you couldn't trust, and they're passing these secret messages and they're getting to Washington. And the people didn't even know. The Secret Six didn't know who each other was. So they couldn't be tortured out of it. I mean, the lengths these guys went to is so exciting. Um, Corky was talking about how Washington was so hard to kill. Um, Here's a article, a clip I put up at random. Um, it's from USA Today. In Washington, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. The National Archives quote General Washington in a letter to his brother following the French and Indian War. He wasn't kidding. In a piece written for Washington's birthday this week, the Washington Post reveals America's first president was nigh indestructible. In his lifetime, Washington bested smallpox, malaria, infection, abscesses, tuberculosis, dysentery, and a boil the size of two fists. That's not even mentioning the battles he survived. Washington claimed that during the French and Indian War, 4 bullets ripped through his coat and 2 horses were shot while he rode them. He apparently had so many close calls, he was rumored to be dead, yet somehow managed to live to 67 years old. That's a, I mean, looks like he was a little bit ordained for him to be in charge of this country. I mean, that's amazing that he was that hard to kill. Um, at the end of the war, they wanted to make him king because that's all they knew. You know, when you believe in organization and you go to another organization, you're looking for something new, but you also bring that familiar with you, right? Our church services are patterned after a church that none of you have been to, right? Because there's only so many ways to have opening prayer songs, right? And so, well, I mean, why reinvent the wheel? But in this case, he absolutely refused to be the king. We're not doing that. We're not doing that. Period. End of story. And they had to force him to be the first president. Um, he had to be coerced, and he only served 1 term. In other revolutions, the tyrants rule until they die, and then their kids rule until they die. We're on the third tyrant for North Korea. Third generation tyranny established 1948, right? And we have 48 or 52, somewhere around there. Um, they rule until their societies crumble. Our nation vested the power to wage war in an office that changes hands. That was unique because The king is the one who leads you out to battle. So we had to have a commander in chief. They had to think about that. How do we do that without a king? How do we go to battle without a centralized authority? And that's when they came up with the office of president, and that this power needs to be, and that the declarations of war need to come from Congress. I do wish we would get back to that, right? At least George W. went to Congress. Okay. That was the last guy to go to Congress to start a war. We've been at war for 25 years. Okay. Okay. They just keep doing it. Right. That's Trump has done overthrown 2 countries this term. Right. Right. It's like what happened if Trump won with no new wars, bro? What are you doing? Right. I don't disagree, but if you're going to throw that much clout, that much cannon fodder at something, you need to go ask for permission, and you need to explain to the American people what you're doing. Right? This is scary, right? We might agree with Trump's doing today. We don't know who's going to be president in 3 years. We don't know when they're going to look at what he did and say, oh my, it's on. I'm doing all this now. Washington was terrified as president to set precedent. He knew everything he did was going to be groundbreaking, foundation setting. So he's very, very restrained. Now Jefferson did send the same author, the Barbary Pirates, right? Right? Same author, but we did do some of this military action without Congress at the founding, limited actions, but not what we do today. Since World War II, we've been kind of in a pickle, though. Washington died of a cold in 1799. That was the end of it. This is impossible to read, but I really need to focus on this because the leadership in this country is ancient. Okay, no offense to the people present, but we shouldn't have every office in the land occupied by octogenarians. That's insane. Okay, that means we're skipping a generation. Generation X, us 50-year-olds, are just never going to have a shot. We're just not getting that, right? When I was in leadership in my previous company, everybody was 20 years older than me, and I was always the kid. And I'm like, what are you talking about, right? And so when I came to the company I work for now, it was so refreshing because my boss and his boss, we are all within 3 years of each other. I mean, it's also really nice to be able to tell to quote Happy Gilmore and have them understand, right? you know, is it the old one? I was just, okay, I've been quoting MASH, right? Right? To bring it back a little bit. But the signers, the average age of the signer were 44 and a half years old. And they ranged from 26 to 70. 43 of them were 50 or under. 21 were 40 or under. The 30-year-olds don't get any respect today. Zilch. And it's a shame because you have to have the opportunity to lead and make mistakes when you're young enough to absorb it. When you're young enough to, whoops, right? If you go from nothing, now you're the department head of a company, right? You don't have those experiences. You don't have that time that in service to build it up. Our military is the exception. The way our military is set up is that very young people get incredible amounts of responsibility. I mean, I was in charge of hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment when I was 20 years old. I was, and the give, and my experiences aside, the men who decided who lived and died when we evacuated Afghanistan were E4 and below, which means that we're 24 years old or less, deciding which lady in that sewer ditch gets on the plane and which one gets thrown to the Taliban. Okay, then we come home from making decisions like that, and they want you to have a 4-year degree to be assistant manager at 7-Eleven, and you're like, what? What are you talking about? Right? We've been all over the world, and we have all this responsibility and international travel, and being in countries we don't belong, being in countries that do belong, and taking care of equipment. I mean, the Air Force mechanic, 18-year-old is keeping an F-18 in the sky. You understand if that goes sideways, it could take out a trailer park. Okay. It's not just money, it's his lives. And the fact that the founders were so young and the military men were so young, if you go to Philadelphia, there's a there's a museum where they have bronze statues of all the signers with their ages when they signed it on plaques at their feet. And it's the size of the people. And you can see how big they were. You can see how Washington was bigger than everybody. Washington was my height, by the way. That was big back then. 5'5" was a regular person. And anything up towards 6 foot was giant, right? And you could see how young these guys were. And that wouldn't fly today, except in the military. The military, lieutenant commanders and which is what is that in everybody else? 04, right? Majors, right? Right? They're less than 30, right around 30 years old. And that's a pretty big rank in the US military. An 04 can even command some ships, some very small ships in the Navy. But we got to keep this into account because if we don't, we run amok of the Bible. David, Joseph, and Yeshua were all would all be disqualified today for any type of leadership position, right? They wouldn't pay attention to David. David was this. Remember, he was the youngest of the family. Samuel said to Jesse, "Are these all the children?" He said, "There remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is tending the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him for him, for we will not sit down here until he comes here." So he sent and brought him in, and he was ruddy with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And Yahweh said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." And then Genesis 37, 3-4, Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a very colored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Joseph became the actual leader of the nation of Egypt. And he was probably in his 30s when that happened, because a lot of bad stuff happened to that guy before he became the leader, but that's still pretty darn young. And then Yeshua, who's believed our message, to whom has the arm of Yahweh been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty, so we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. Yeshua was about 30 years old when he started his ministry. Today, 30-year-olds are just. I've been that guy. I was in leadership at 32, and there were a bunch of guys about mid-50s who staged a coup. They didn't want me to be their boss. And my boss at the time said, "You didn't apply." And that was that, right? And it's difficult to be in charge of people who are old. You have to be very respectful when you're in charge of people who are older than you. You have to be very humble and understand that there's not a lot of change. They're not making a lot of change. They've got their ways, but you can leverage that experience and you can learn how to make other people better by using their knowledge and their wisdom and respect what they do for a living. But people can't learn those skills if they never get the opportunity. And when you look at Congress, the Mitch McConnell, you could almost carbon date that guy. He is so old. My guy, Congressman Graves, has been our congressman since we moved here. And he's a good congressman. But come on, dude, there's it's got to be somebody in the Northland that can take your place, right? We have to hand this stuff off, and they get in there and they can't, and they want to have locked up elections that nobody can get unchallenged, and they never leave. And um so the declaration closes with, "We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledged our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Great leaders know they're going to be judged for their behavior. That's why we swear an oath on the Bible when we swear an oath when we uh, sign up for the military. But when you get sworn into something, you often put your hat in on the Bible. That's not. It's because you know you're going to be judged. You know that the actions that you take when you have authority, that you're not the highest authority, and even the president of this country might be the highest authority on earth, but everything he does is going to be judged by the creator at some point in time. And these guys doing all this stuff in the daylight indicated that they were turning it over to God. That they were saying, "Hey, we're letting the chips land where they may." Um, and so today, one nation under God, it's a day to give thanks to our earthly forefathers and a day to give thanks for this country. And did you know that we produced almost all the world's Bibles? This nation produced. Yeah. Now that they're electronic, it's not that big a deal. But when Bibles are printed, they're almost all printed in the United States of America. Yahweh has done great and marvelous things with this country, and we've sinned greatly and have served valiantly. Our country is like none other the world has seen. We're a mix. We value freedom. The culture our founders set persists despite vicious attacks from outside our nation and horrible rot from inside our nation. One of our biggest strengths is also one of our biggest weaknesses. We loathe authority. We do not like being told what to do, to the point that we will make detrimental decisions because we just don't want to be told what to do. That's going to be a problem when Yeshua returns, by the way. That's going to be a big problem because we're going to be like, okay, Liz, we're going to vote on it. And he's going to be like, no, you're not.